Welcome to another video by Quiet Mind, Happy Heart. This video is intended to help you fall asleep. We do make these videos intentionally boring to put you to sleep. Tonight you will hear a very boring story about living in the country. So we hope you have sweet dreams, and now let's begin the story. The world, they say, changed more between the year 1800 and the year 1900 than it had in the previous 500 years. That century, the 19th century, was the dawn of a new epoch in the history of humankind, the epoch of great cities and the end of the way of country life. At the start of the 19th century, most people still lived in the countryside. All over the world they dwelled in little towns and villages, and engaged in agriculture or in occupations that were of service to agriculture. They rarely traveled and lived close to their work because swift means of transportation had not yet been developed. The few who traveled went on foot or in very slow sailing ships. Even still, by means of horse and carriage, capable of traveling only 60 miles a day. Just think of it, 60 miles a day. Here and there, in those times, a town grew a little larger than its neighbors, as a port or as a center of government. But all the towns in the world, with more than 100,000 inhabitants, could be counted on a person's fingers. So it was in the beginning of the 19th century. By the end, the invention of railways and steamships and complex agricultural machinery had changed all these things, changed them beyond all hope of return. The large stores and the countless conveniences of larger towns were suddenly possible, and no longer existed than they were brought into competition with the homely resources of the rural centers. People were drawn to the cities by an overwhelming attraction. Yet the developments of the 19th century were only the dawning of the new order. The introduction of railways was only the first step in that development of those means of locomotion which had finally revolutionized human life. By the year 2000, railways and roads had vanished altogether. The railways, robbed of their rails, had become weedy ridges and ditches upon the face of the earth. The old roads, hammered by hand or rolled by rough iron rollers, and cut by iron hooves and wheels into ruts and puddles, often many inches deep, had been replaced by tracks made of a substance called Eadhamite. This Eadhamite, for it was named after its patentee, ranks with the invention of printing and the steam engine as one of the epoch-making discoveries in world history. When Edom discovered the substance, he probably thought it was a mere cheap substitute for rubber. It only cost a few pennies a ton, but you never can tell what an invention will do. It was the genius of a man called Warming that pointed to the possibility of using it, not only for the wheels of tires, but as a road substance, and who organized the enormous network of public highways that now speedily cover the world. These public highways were made along longitudinal divisions. On the outer of either side went cyclists and conveyances traveling at a speed of less than 40 miles an hour. In the middle, motor vehicles capable of speeds of over 100 miles an hour, and then the inner lane. Warming, in the face of enormous ridicule, had reserved for vehicles traveling at speeds of over 120 miles an hour. For 10 years the inner lane was vacant, but years later these inner lanes were the most crowded of all. But to tell you all of this would take us far away from our story of Denton and Elizabeth. They had been separated and reunited, and they still could not marry. For Denton, it was his only fault, had no money. Neither had Elizabeth until she was 21, and as of yet she was only 18. At 21, all the property of her mother would come to her, for that was the custom of the time. She did not know that it was possible to anticipate her fortune, and Denton was far too delicate to suggest such a thing. So things were hopelessly stuck between them. Elizabeth said that she was very unhappy, and that nobody understood her but Denton, and that when she was away from him, she was wretched, and Denton said that his heart longed for her day and night, and they met as often as they could to enjoy the discussion of their common sorrows. They met one day at their little seat in the park. To their eyes, their surroundings had something of the quality of a prison, and they were talking as they had talked together 100 times before, of how they might escape from it and at last be happy together. To wait 3 whole years until she was 21, they both agreed was just impossible. Yet to marry now and be very poor in the cities of that time was, for anyone who had lived pleasantly a very dreadful thing. In the old days that had drawn to an end in the 18th century, there had been such a pretty proverb of love. Living in a cottage, and in those days the poor of the countryside had in fact lived in flower-covered, diamond-windowed cottages, with the sweet air and earth all around them, amidst tangled hedges and the song of birds, and with the ever-changing sky overhead. But all this changed. Suddenly Denton shouted, "If only we had lived in those days! If only we had lived in the past!" For, to their eyes, even the 19th century was seen through a mist of romance. Then suddenly Denton was moved to speak of something that had already flickered across his mind. He had hit upon it at last. "Suppose," he said, "we went into the country." She looked at him to see if he was serious, and then asked, "The country?" He said, "Yes, beyond there, beyond the hills." She stood then in front of him and said, "How strange it would be if we really could." "Well, why not then?" he asked. Then, because he knew he might seem childish to her, he hesitated. But she looked at him with enthusiasm glowing in her eyes. His suggestion seemed to her an impossible dream on that day, but the next day they talked about it again, and it was strangely less impossible. Each time they talked about it, it seemed more possible and more desirable to them. In a week or so it was quite possible, and after another week it was the inevitable thing they must do. A great enthusiasm for the country took hold of them. The tumult of the town overwhelmed them. They marveled that this simple way out of their troubles had never come upon them before. Our two young people then secretly married, and were going out of the city with joy. She wore a new dress of white in an old-fashioned pattern, and he had a bundle of provisions strapped on his back. Along the very verge of the outermost lane of the highway, the young people walked in silence, newlywed and oddly shy of one another's company. Many things were shouted at them as they went along, but they continued with steadfast eyes into the country, paying no attention to such cries. At the end of the day, they were both very hungry and footsore, for walking was a rare exercise, and they sat down on the grass and looked back for the first time at the city from which they had come, shining wide and splendid in the blue haze of the valley. Elizabeth was a little afraid of the unenclosed space, but Denton reassured her, and overhead a white-winged bird circled in the blue sky. They talked only a little until they had eaten. Then he spoke of the happiness that was now certainly theirs, of the foolishness of not breaking out sooner from that magnificent prison of modern city life. After they had eaten and rested, they rose up and went on their way towards the hills. And in the evening they came to a deserted village, with its houses that seemed so small and so odd to them. They found it golden in the glory of the sunset, desolate and still. They walked from one house to another, marveling at their quaint simplicity, and wondering which one they should choose for their temporary home. And at last, in a sunlit corner of a room, they came upon a wild flower, a little flower of blue. And they decided upon that house, but they did not remain in it long that night. And so these two young time travelers began their exile. They lived there for a week, and for all that week the days were cloudless, and the nights of starry glory that were invaded each a little more by the crescent moon. And then came a change in the weather. Suddenly the wind set the beech trees swaying and whispering, and Elizabeth shivered. And then, far away, the lightning flashed, and the distant thunder marched about the sky. And even as they stood astonished, came the first headlong raindrops of the storm. Holding hands, these children of the city ran down the hill to their home in infinite astonishment. And when they reached it, Elizabeth was weeping, and the dark ground around them was white and brittle with the pelting hail. Then began a strange and terrible night for them. For the first time in their civilized lives, they were in absolute darkness. As the gusts of the storm struck the worn-out cottage, it groaned and shuddered. The storm seemed to last forever, until at last they dozed between the thunderclaps, and then, very swiftly, the storm came to an end, and as the last patter of the rain died away, they heard an unfamiliar sound. Then it came again. It was the barking of dogs. Denton spoke, but the barking drowned out his voice. The sound of the dogs had a curious effect on him, and he cried out, Odd, disused emotions began to stir in him, and his face changed. Suddenly he turned, and uttering words that were incomprehensible to Elizabeth, he chased away the dogs. After a long silence, Elizabeth said, "I don't like dogs." "Well then," he replied, "we simply cannot stay here." "We must go back," he repeated, glancing over his shoulder to see if the dogs had kept their distance. "We have been so happy here for a time, but our world is too civilized. Ours is the age of the city. We cannot stand any more of this country life." Then they looked for a while into one another's faces, and then Denton took her hand. "Each generation," he said, "has the life of its time. I see it all so plainly now. In the city, that is the life to which we were born, and to live in any other way is pure folly. Coming here to the country, it was just a dream, and this is our awakening." "But it has been such a pleasant dream," she said. And for a long time neither spoke. Then silently, side by side, they went across the empty space into the main road and set their faces resolutely towards the distant city, towards the complex city of modern life. Thank you for joining us. Good night.